Conflict Response Institute, and I am very glad to chair this final session of our research program this semester, and I want to thank those who organized the event, in particular Jess and Sophie. And today we have quite a program. We have a lot on our plate on a very sensitive issue, probably the most atrocious sequence of acts that took place in 1995, in July 1995, around Srebrenica, and which were classified as genocide since. Now, these events are now commemorated on the Srebrenica Memorial Day, and there is an organization devoted to this memory of genocide, and we will hear a lot more about it from Elinor Chauhan. So today we have a number of speakers, so I will allow them to introduce themselves as they start their 15-minute slot, and we'll have to be quite strict about this if possible in order to leave as much time as possible for a Q&A at the end. So Elinor Chauhan will begin by describing the work of the organization and including a short film on Srebrenica revisited 25 years on. Edita Marek will talk about personal story and reflections on the ongoing genocide denial in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is by no means an uncontested issue. And Eric Gordy will actually talk about denial again, but perhaps with a slightly more optimistic perspective that how no became maybe and why it matters. And then we'll move on to a comparative framework to Syria with the work of Dr. Aitam Halamwi and Yasmine Nahlawi, who are going to talk about Syrian stories and Syrian narratives and making parallels with this incredible sequence of events. It's worth remembering that Srebrenica was under the protection of the United Nations, that it was actually one of the safe havens, so-called, that the United Nations claimed to have established during the Bosnian conflict, and that it represents not only one of the worst atrocities on record, but one of the most appalling example of international inertia, of international passivity in the face of criminals, and that there is a blame or shame that is widely distributed across all the Western powers who sat idle during the massacres and who, by their complete powerlessness, enable the genocide to happen. So it's not, in other words, it isn't a story that belongs to the Balkans. It's a story that belongs to humanity at large, and which has a lot of lessons for us to learn from. So without further ado, because I realize we're going to have so much to go through, and I want us to be able to have a genuine conversation and discussion at the end, I would like to invite Elinor Chauhan to take the microphone, or the Zoom microphone, and lead us on this journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to be here with you today and to tell you a little about the work of the charity Remembering Srebrenica. I'd also, in my session, like to highlight the importance of genocide education and the different ways that we deliver that. But I think it's important that we get some context first of all. And we're going to screen a short film. It's about 5 or 6 minutes to give you just an overview of the conflict, and then I'll resume my talk with you.
In 1995, Europe was the scene of genocide. The bodies who lie here are the victims of the greatest atrocity on European soil since the Holocaust. More than 8,000 men and boys were hunted down, murdered, and buried in mass graves. Their remains are still being found today. 25 years on, the survivors and eyewitnesses who speak of the genocide risk being unheard.
Srebrenica je bila jako lijep grad, mali grad, ali je bio pun života, to je bila jedna mala oaza. Čak je mirisala, svaka je kuća imala svoju terasu prepunu cvijeća. Po danas da sam ostala bez ikoga, bez oba dvoje djece, bez muža. Oprostite, suza mi je izdajica, nikad ne bi to uradila, ali suza, mogu pričati o svemu, ali kad dođe do djece da pričam o djeci, zaista mi bude tada najteže.
Bosnia and Herzegovina, one of the world's great crossroads, a melting pot of cultures and identities. All eyes were on this country in 1984 as it hosted the Winter Olympic Games. Within 10 years, the world's eyes would be turned back on Bosnia, but for different reasons. On the ashes of the former Yugoslavia, leaders exploiting identity politics rose to power across the region. Ultra-nationalist forces planned to create a greater Serbia, filled only with ethnically pure Serbs. This meant Bosnian Muslims were cleansed from the land. Serb forces, the most powerful military in the region, swept across Bosnia, sending people fleeing from villages in the north and east to concentration camps and slaughtering thousands of others. This was a battle of empire expansion, portrayed as a battle of faith and ethnicity. By 1995, Bosnian Serb forces had taken nearly every village in eastern Bosnia and flushed them of Muslims. Srebrenica was one of only a few UN safe areas in the region, and tens of thousands of refugees poured in. On July 11th, Srebrenica fell. As he entered the town, General Ratko Mladic spoke to Serb cameras.
Evo nas 11. jula 1995. godine u srpskoj Srebrenici. Uoči još jednog velikog praznika srpskoga, poklanjamo srpskom narodu ovaj grad i napokon došao je trenutak da se posle bune protiv Dahija Turcima osvetimo na ovom prostoru.
As the Serbs moved in, women and children gathered around the UN base at HCRI. But men and boys like Hassan were worried about how the Serbs would treat them and made for the woods.
In July 1995, I lost my father and my twin brother. I tried to escape from Srebrenica through the forests alongside with them, but unfortunately I am the only one who survived. It took me 6 days and 6 nights to reach Tuzla. It was a real suffering. I did not have anything to eat. I was being hunted like an animal.
The few hundred Dutch peacekeepers at the base, waiting for UN backup that never came, handed over their weapons and the men and the boys to the Serbs. For those men and the men who had tried to escape, this was the beginning of the single most horrific week of slaughter in recent history.
They promised that we would not be killed and that we would be treated according to all the Geneva Conventions.
The thousands of men and boys captured were then loaded onto trucks and taken to execution sites.
I noticed the rows and rows of dead bodies in front of me, and I don't know when I was shot. I just remember later that I was lying on my stomach, that I was shivering and trembling. One of the soldiers said to the other to check all the bodies, but he refused. He said they are already dead and left the place. I never could imagine that I could survive at that moment. I just waited to die because I lost so much blood. Someone was moving in front of me, and it was other survivor, and I asked him, "Are you alive? Are you alive?" He said, "Yes, yes. Come and untie me, please." We hid everywhere, in the streams, in graveyards, in destroyed houses and forests, because Serb soldiers were patrolling. They collected the dead bodies and put them on the vehicles, and they took them to a mass grave. And it was a horrific scene at that moment for me.
Hassan Hassanovic, a survivor of the genocide, is one of the guides at the Memorial Centre just a few miles north of Srebrenica and home to the former UN peacekeeper base.
I survived to tell the story of Srebrenica genocide. It's very important that people know what happened in Srebrenica. that we educate young generations to make sure that similar thing does not happen ever again.
2010. godine sam ukopala oba dvoje djece i muža. Mog starijeg sina sam ukopala samo 2 koste od nogu, tako isto i od muža. Mali sin, rekli su mi da je kompletno tijelo, sam ne ima lijeve ruke, pola malog prsta.
25 years on, the survivors of Srebrenica are still fighting to have their voices heard. The strength of survivors in sharing their stories and fighting for justice inspires us to take action. Join us at Remembering Srebrenica and pledge this year to stand up to intolerance and hatred, to raise awareness of the Bosnian genocide, and to make every action matter.
Get my slides up. I'd just like to, the picture on the first slide is significant to me. This dear woman, when I first visited Srebrenica on a very cold December day in December 2013, she showed me behind the long list of names from her family that had perished in this terrible genocide. And to me, it changed something forever in my heart, in that I committed to help the cause and learn from the experiences of people in Bosnia, and specifically in Srebrenica. So what I'd like to do today, we've seen a very brief summary of the background of the conflict. I want to tell you a little bit about the charity Remembering Srebrenica, the educational resources that we have, and the importance of remembering, and the importance of learning the lessons and the programs we have for that. As we've seen in 1995, 8,372 men and boys were very barbarically killed in Srebrenica, and that was under the nose of the world, and it was the first genocide that was broadcast into people's homes. Apart from that, up to 100,000 people died in the conflict, and over 2 million people were displaced, and it was the worst atrocity on European soil since the Second World War. And for me, it's important that we remember that this is not just a statistic we're looking at. These people, this list of names, it was somebody's husband, somebody's son, somebody's father, and you know, the women that have been left behind. It's had a profound impact on their lives. So our vision as a charity is a society free from hatred, and we work to achieve this through remembering. And in July every year, we have a memorial week where we have events up and down the country remembering those that perished. We also take people on delegations over to Bosnia. We visit Srebrenica, and there we get to meet the survivors, we get to visit the significant places there. And through that experience, it connects you emotionally to what happened there. And when people come back, they volunteer with the charity, and they pledge to stand up to hatred and intolerance through organising initiatives and events to help us achieve our aims. We're largely run by volunteers. We've got about 1,500 volunteers across the country, and we've got regional boards, which we've got 8 of, and also we've got 3 country boards as well. Over the course of last year, we had over 1,000 events, which were delivered by our various regional boards. In order, to remember, the European Parliament accepts that the Srebrenica resolution and calls upon all EU countries to actually commemorate on the 11th of July. And I believe that the UK is currently the only country that does that. And that's marked with, certainly in Manchester, we've held a memorial service at the cathedral now for around 5 years or so. A big part of what we do is around the education, and I really believe that it's important that we visit schools and universities and colleges and wherever we can, really, to impart the messages of the consequences of hate. And I very much like this quote from the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, which tells us that we must learn about Holocaust and other genocides so that we can be more human, more gentle, more caring, more compassionate, valuing every person as being of infinite worth, so precious that we know that such atrocities will never happen again, and that the world will be a more humane place that is hostile to such horrendous occurrences. We will remember them so that we are not doomed to repeat them. The importance of genocide education cannot be underestimated. Even though we know of many genocides through history, the Holocaust being the most significant in terms of numbers, that there are very clear stages that a genocide goes through, and I'll mention that a bit more. But also, the goal of genocide education is not solely to educate students and people about the accounts of genocide, but also it paves the road to the most effective way of anti-racist education. And I think with the incidence of hate crime in the UK having doubled over the past 5 years, it's very much needed. Genocide is the consequences of deep-rooted discrimination within our societies and the result of a series of human rights violations that render people vulnerable to further exploitation. Racism and its dangers, therefore, are displayed in their most visible and terrible forms in genocide, making it a unique opportunity to teach and learn about these complex events. Genocide and human rights education creates an invaluable opportunity to explore the various choices available to all those affected by genocide and the decisions that could have a positive impact on society, even in the most difficult of times. It also opens possibility for empathetic forms of education to shift barriers between societies where the concept of the other is frequently raised and reinforced in harmful and destructive ways. And for genocide education to be an effective antidote to racism, then it has to counteract denial, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. But denial is a problem following is the final stage in any Holocaust, and something that is prevalent in Bosnia at the moment. We have a whole host of resources, and I'll just give you a whistle-top tour of what we have, but I highly recommend that you visit our website and experience for yourself. But we have a virtual museum that you can visit, and literally a few weeks ago we launched an excellent podcast series which has had fantastic reviews, so maybe over the Christmas break that might be something that would interest you, and it chronicles the history and people's and survivor experiences through the genocide. We've got lots of videos available and survivor testimonies included in that, and also in written form as well. We have resources for schools that can register and download for all age groups, and that could be integrated into PHCRI lessons or school assemblies, etc. We also have resources for faith organisations, and they can again download these. We have workshops looking at the genocide, and we've conducted those with various organisations, and it gets people thinking and talking about the genocide and relating it to what happened in Bosnia and maybe signs that they can see in society today. And Remembering Srebrenica is proud to work with councils. We work widely with Greater Manchester Combined Authority and the Youth Combined Authority as well, because I think it's really important to engage with young people in this, and it always invigorates me to hear of their ideas in how we can tackle hatred. We also link in with police, with prisons, with trade unions, and also participate in Holocaust Memorial Day activities in January across the country. This was the model of genocide, the 10 stages of genocide that was proposed by Gregory Stanton, an American psychologist. And as you can see there, the final stage of it is the denial, and the stages are not necessarily concurrent, and each is accompanied by a set of actions that could prevent further escalation, hence the importance of education. And discussing these and relating them to Srebrenica is a powerful learning tool, and it helps societies understand how easily it is to go down the slippery slope towards genocide if we don't remedy divisions in society. I think one of the most effective ways I've seen of learning about the genocide is listening to survivor testimony. And we're really privileged to have so many wonderful survivors that have found the courage to recount their stories time after time to educate us. And they do that without bearing hatred towards those that carried this out. The survivor testimony is key in countering denial, and it's imperative that we uphold the truth in order to protect the rights of the past and the future. The truth counters denial, and it upholds, and upholding of the truth and freeing society of the constraints of denial creates new opportunities to educate, learn and commemorate the past and shape collective memory. And we've got a picture here of Munira Subsic, who is president of the Mothers Association of Srebrenica, a very strong woman who has so much goodness in her that's lost 22 members of her family and has been key in providing testimony at The Hague. The visits programme I've mentioned, and it's a valuable way of engaging and getting commitment from volunteers. Again, there's more details on our websites, and I would encourage you, if you are interested and you want to find out more about the programme, to get in touch with us through the website. For me, it's been a powerful way of connecting and keeping connected with what happened there. The impact that we have as a charity, in that last year we reached over 90,000 people, and I think this year that might be even greater with the benefits of Zoom and conferences like this, and that it's made it easier for people to join in our events. Our events have been shown to improve community cohesion, and those participating say that they feel more empowered to tackle hate, and also that they're more likely to interact with people that are different to themselves. And again, a focus of a lot of the events that we do is bringing different communities together so that there is an opportunity during those events to get talking as well. We've got various social media accounts, and I would again highly recommend, please do follow us, find out more about our work, and get in touch with us if you would like to volunteer and get involved with the work. This year's theme for Remembrance Week was Every Action Matters, and that's what I would like to leave you with, that we as individuals all have the power to shape the future, and we all have the power to impact change. And we can do that, we can prevent genocide from developing by actively guarding against prejudice and hate, and by staying informed and by shining the light of our common shared humanity in the darkest places of our societies again, to make sure that we can say never again and mean it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Edita, if you can take up the microphone now. Thank you very much. This was very enlightening, Elena.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me today. I'm truly honored to be here. Besides sharing my personal story, I would like to provide you with some concrete examples of genocide denial and historical revisionism in Bosnian society, as well as implications of such dangerous narratives. I was born in Mostar in 1990. For almost 3 years before the 1992 aggression against my homeland, I lived with my parents in Mostar. We lived a happy life, filled with love and care. I have no memories, but the photos and memories shared with me by my loved ones who have survived the war confirm so. We lived at a time when it really didn't matter which side of the city we lived in, or what name, religion, or any other characteristics we affiliated with. However, what is very important to mention in this context is that we lived on the west side of Mostar, and that we have been Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks. On May 9th, 1993, the siege of Mostar began by the Croatian Defense Council in an attempt of creating Greater Croatia and ethnically cleanse the area of Bosnian Muslims and other non-Croats. The entire leadership of a so-called parastate Herceg Bosna, declared by Croatian nationalists at that time, was sentenced in 2018 to a total of 111 years for a joint criminal enterprise and crimes against humanity, including murders, rape, sexual assault, destruction of property, and the deportation of Bosniaks in 1993 to 1994. Me and my family were forcefully expelled from the apartment where we lived. My father was taken to a concentration camp. In order to save our lives, I had to flee to Germany with my mother in 1993, and that is how I became a refugee. My first memory of Mostar is from 1997, when we came back from Germany. Tens of thousands of people went missing as a result of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the period between 1992 and 1995. According to International Committee of the Red Cross data, based on tracing requests submitted by families, 6,126 families are still waiting for information about the fate of their 6,586 missing relatives. Me and my mother are one of those families. I'm still searching for my father's remains. As survivors, we are confronted with constant denial and historical revisionism, denial of the war crimes committed, denial of Srebrenica genocide, denial of systematic destruction of 100-year-old cultural, historical, and religious institutions by well-known perpetrators, and a reversal of the roles of the perpetrator and the victim. I would like now to refer to Srebrenica genocide denial. Despite overwhelming and incontestable forensic evidence and unanimous rulings by world's most esteemed international courts, denial of the Srebrenica genocide persists to this day, not just in Serbia and in the Serb-dominated parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but even around the world. And I will share with you some examples later on throughout the presentation. But I would like to refer now to three main tactics or even trends, I'm not sure how to refer to them, that are very often seen by those who deny genocide in Srebrenica. The first refers to glorification of war criminals. We have witnessed an ongoing government-sponsored attempt by the contemporary government of the Republika Srpska, which is a smaller entity of Bosnia. And they're engaged in a revisionism of the events in Srebrenica. In February last year, at the initiative of the leading party in RS, this is the shortened version of Republika Srpska, the RS announced the establishment of the Independent International Commission for investigating the sufferings of all peoples in the Srebrenica region in the period from 1992 to 1995, as well as another commission with a mandate to investigate the wartime suffering of Serbs in Sarajevo. The establishment of these two commissions provoked strong condemnation within the Federation as well as by the international community, and it seemed to represent the culmination of more than a decade of genocide denial and revisionism by the RS government. Most notably, Milorad Dodik, the current Serb member of the Bosnian presidency, has called the Srebrenica genocide a fabricated myth, as well as the greatest deception of the 20th century. The current mayor of the municipality of Srebrenica, Mladen Grujičić, is also a genocide denier who openly rejects the verdicts of the international courts. Apart from the establishment of new investigative commissions, there have been several reported incidents in the municipality of Srebrenica after Grujičić was elected in 2016 as the first Serb mayor in the post-war Srebrenica. This year only, there have been Islamophobic attempts of intimidation of Bosnian population, as well as an incident at Srebrenica's first primary school, where students displayed symbols of Serbian nationalism, but barely any disciplinary action followed, and there was no really any condemnation by the school's administration, let alone by the community itself. In addition to these politicians and the media outlets which seem to propagate them, denial of the Srebrenica genocide is widely peddled also by religious, cultural, and educational institutions in both Serbia and RS. In particular, Orthodox Church has helped to assert the Serbs' revisionist narrative in post-genocide Srebrenica. The construction of the Budak Orthodox Church in 2013 near the Srebrenica Memorial Cemetery and the mass grave of the Srebrenica's victims was condemned as a senseless provocation by the international community. Also, what is very important in this context is that in schools across Serbia and RS, children are taught alternative historical accounts of the war in Bosnia, which either reverse the narrative of Srebrenica or they completely omit it. In terms of what kind of message does the current political leadership send to future generations, it should be mentioned that in 2016, Dodik opened the doors to public student dormitory called Dr. Radovan Karadžić to students at the University of Istočno Sarajevo in Pale, which is near the Bosnian capital. 4 days after the opening of the dormitory, the ICTY sentenced Karadžić to 40 years of prison. The ICTY convicted Radovan Karadžić, former president of Republika Srpska and supreme commander of its armed forces, of genocide, crimes against humanity, and violations of the laws or customs of war committed by Serb forces during the armed conflict in Bosnia in between 92 and 95. The second very often used tactic refers to disputing the number and identities of Srebrenica's victims. Revisionists attempt to minimize the death toll of more than 8,372 victims of the Srebrenica genocide, despite the forensic evidence and legal consensus substantiating this figure. Typical strategies of Srebrenica genocide denial dispute the number of victims known to have perished in 1995, the circumstances of their deaths, and their very identities. Historical revisionists often claim that the total number of victims murdered in Srebrenica is drastically lower than the judicial affirmed death toll of 8,372. Bosnian Serb leaders frequently cite arbitrary figures, low as 2,000 victims, and deploy numerous conspiracy theories to explain discrepancies between their numbers and the international consensus. They assert that many of the Bosniaks buried in the memorial cemetery died of causes such as exhaustion, that the majority were in fact killed in combat or as terrorists and not as unarmed civilians. And finally, that Bosniaks in fact are not even legitimate people, and that as such, they cannot be targeted for genocide. There's last point I would like to refer, and it's also very often brought up. It refers to theories of an international anti-Serb conspiracy used to undermine international courts. This is actually one of the most common genocide denial tactics. Deniers always seek to undermine the legitimacy of the international courts, whose investigations and judgments affirmed the facts of Srebrenica genocide. The most common approach relies on fabricated theories of international conspiracy and anti-Serb bias, not only within legal institutions, international legal institutions, but also within international community. But besides these local and regional revisionism tactics, there seems to be a pattern of historical revisionism surrounding the Srebrenica genocide internationally too. And I think it's also important to mention two instances, two very recent instances of denial. In October 2019, the genocide revisionist and Slobodan Milošević apologist, Peter Handke, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, with the Nobel Committee pointedly refusing to acknowledge his decades of writing and oratory in defense of the greater Serbia cause. In his writings, actually what Handke referred to pretty much goes along with the narrative by those who deny genocide, and it goes to the very heart of the identity of Bosniaks, circumstances of deaths of victims, of the numbers, and pretty much challenging everything that was judicially approved and confirmed. Another instance refers to the most recent publication of an American scholar, Jessica Stern, and her publication, My War Criminal, where she actually tried to humanize one of the Srebrenica genocide's masterminds, again, Radovan Karadzic, as a product of years of interviews with him during his detention at The Hague. This is a very, maybe atypical or unusual genocide denial example, because Ms. Stern, she actually referred in her, she does not contest the genocide itself, but this publication pretty much did upset the victims, and it was condemned by the international community, but also by the academic community here in the Balkans. And also, I would like to conclude by a bit longer conclusion and maybe some messages on a more optimistic note in a way, but also I would like to point out what could happen and what are potential implications if we do not speak out against genocide denial. On the 25th anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide, we must take action to confront the growing trend of Bosnian genocide denial, both locally and internationally. We cannot let the voices of revisionists silence the experience of survivors if we do not want to witness new potential conflicts and violence as a result of continuous genocide denial and our silence and inaction. I will just illustrate how genocide against Bosnian Muslims has been a source of inspiration for some of the most violent right-wing terror attacks in the recent history. The 28-year-old white supremacist who murdered 51 Muslim worshippers last March in Christchurch in New Zealand had the names of Serbian nationalists inscribed on the rifle he used to carry out the attacks. In the live stream video of the attack, he can be seen listening to a Chetnik war song glorifying Radovan Karadzic immediately before his first shooting. The genocide against Bosnian Muslims in the 90s also was a source of inspiration for the Norwegian extremist who gunned down 77 people in 2011 shooting. And my last point is that no matter where we are or at what position are we in our society, we can all contribute to the fight against denial of the Srebrenica genocide. Ordinary citizens have access to a range of public and private platforms through which they can take a stance against denial and raise awareness about the genocide in Srebrenica. What I believe should be taken as a next step is to criminalize genocide denial in Bosnia. I believe this is an important subsequent step on the road to justice in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It would be necessary to impose a prison sentences for the public denial of genocide and for glorification of war criminals. Also, educational reform in Bosnia and learning about historical facts equally all over Bosnia and Herzegovina is important, as well as to memorialize and educate younger generations about the Bosnian genocide. And this is something just like the work and all these activities by Remembering Srebrenica do, and I really want to thank you for that. Finally, it is our responsibility to speak out, all of us, to speak out against genocide denial for the dignity of our victims, for healing of our survivors, and for a more prosperous future for our children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edita. So this is very moving and very thought-provoking. Now, Eric, could you follow this up, and we can carry on the discussion about the forms of denial that took place even immediately after the massacre by the removal of the human remains or various attempts at hiding the extent of the massacres. So, Eric, please.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for having me here. I'm very sorry that I can't be in Manchester with you today, or go anywhere at all. But it's good to see you electronically. So what I would like to talk about is processes of denial, is to elaborate a bit more on some of the things that that Edita raised in her presentation, because what I found by looking at denial is that it's more than simply saying no. It's more than simply saying something didn't happen. And in fact, as it develops, it's a creative and responsive process, interesting because in order to sustain denial over the long term, it's necessary to engage in some level of acknowledgement. So if we want to talk about what happened in Srebrenica, this is generally known. And what happened became known for a number of reasons. I mean, partly because of investigation, partly because of surveillance through the air and through interception of conversations and documents of military commanders. Very, very quickly it was known. There was very large-scale killing. There was attempt to destroy the evidence. I won't go over again all of the evidence that's already been presented, but as a consequence of this, the early efforts at denial to say that that the events did not happen, that they were much smaller, and so on, these were crude, and they were ineffective. The first major strategy was to try not only to minimize the number of victims and fatalities, but to present the killings of civilians as though they were killings in battle. And this effort probably reached its high point in 2002, when it was named as a commission appointed by Republika Srpska, but the author was really one person. Put out their report on, they called it Report on Case Srebrenica, and it summarized all of the denial claims that were prominent to date as of 2002. So what this report claimed is that there were about 2,000 fatalities rather than the over 8,000 that are known, that 1,600 of those were battle fatalities, and the rest were accidental, and then there may have been 100 or so people who were killed by forces of Republika Srpska as revenge or excesses. Okay, so that's what it was said in the report. The purpose of the report was that it could be used in defense at cases related to Srebrenica before the International Criminal Tribunal. It was used in one case, the case of Miroslav Deronic, and the court, in its decision on that case, paid special attention to that report. They rejected it as evidence, and the judges said it was one of the worst examples of revisionism that they had ever seen. But because of the outrage that greeted the release of this report, you had the formation of the commission that produced the 2004 report on Srebrenica, which is in fact the only commission investigating events of the violence in the 1990s that has actually produced a report. And that report gives a fairly full and accurate account of events. It was followed by a set of official apologies coming from both Republika Srpska and from authorities in Serbia itself. The effect of this became even stronger with the release of a secretly circulating video showing members of a paramilitary group executing a group of young prisoners in 2005. And with that, this first stage of denial really became impossible and unsustainable. And what it led to was not the abandonment of denial, but the development of new steps and of new strategies of denial. And I've investigated these in some details. I give 13 steps of denial in my book on denial. I only want to concentrate on a couple of them here. You can read the book if you want. Here are the ones that I like to concentrate on. These are in addition to the ones that Edita has already mentioned in her presentation. The first strategy of denial that develops that is more than pure denial is the strategy of altering the context into which the facts fit. And this is a strategy that is probably best represented in the work of, it was a non-governmental organization that was financed and supported by the government of Republika Srpska called the Historical Project of Srebrenica, headed by this guy named Stevan Karganovic, who's an interesting fellow all by himself. He's got a whole lifetime of fraud behind him. Now apparently he's active again. He's saying that the COVID virus is a conspiracy to control the population. But the main argument that this group developed, they said everybody's concentrating on the 8,000 something deaths in 1995. It says, but if you look at not just 1995, but the period between 1992 and 1995, you find a large number of deaths, and then they try to inflate the numbers of deaths from members of other groups in order to make it appear as though they were equivalent. And the strategy was embodied in a lot of different ways. Edita has already told you about the construction of a church near the Srebrenica memorial site. There is also a counter memorial site near the Srebrenica memorial site, where in the days after the official memorial, they hold a counter memorial for mostly military victims of not only the war in which the Srebrenica genocide happened, but also other wars. I mean, a further attempt is is apparent in another effort that, that again, Edita has already mentioned, that is the attempt by the Republika Srpska government to revoke its support for the 2004 report on Srebrenica and to appoint these two new commissions that would produce what I guess could be called alternative facts. Now, the thing about the shift in context as a strategy, some of this is what, if you were a lawyer, you might call a tu quoque defense. Tu quoque means literally, if, for those of you who know Latin, you too. And fundamentally what it is a claim that one crime cannot be prosecuted legitimately because there exist other crimes of a similar type that are not prosecuted. Okay, so this is a rhetorical strategy. It's generally not admitted in courts of law, and there's a reason for this. The judges will say we can only try the claims that that are before us and not crimes that we are that we're not trying. But there are ways in which this strategy of altering the context becomes more refined. The first of these is to alter the strategy by comparison, to say, yes, maybe you have a genocide here with 8,372 victims, but this is less than the 900,000 or so victims in Rwanda. This is less than the millions of victims of the Second World War genocides, and so on and so on. That is to diminish the importance of the events in context, and again, not just in the context of the war, but in the context of the history of the world. So comparison is one of these strategies, and dilution is another. And this is something that you often see happening in debates in Serbia on the question of whether the genocide should be acknowledged or memorialized. What you will find is people saying, well, yes, victims should be acknowledged, but victims should also be acknowledged from our side, or victims should be acknowledged, but combatants should be acknowledged too, or victims of this war should be acknowledged, but victims of all other wars should be acknowledged as well, which is why you see things like parliamentary resolutions and memorials going up with dedications to groups like all of the civilian and military victims of all wars in the history of humanity. So that's the first strategy, altering the context. The second strategy is the strategy of calling into question the authority and credibility of the institutions that find facts and instances of fact-finding. And again, Edita has already talked about a part of this, claims about the legitimacy or lack of legitimacy, or objectivity or lack of objectivity of judicial institutions, including international courts. But it goes beyond this into claims about the insufficiently national character of human rights organizations and victims organizations and organizations calling for investigation and memorialization, and goes even further into claims of a kind of global conspiracy. That is, that efforts to investigate, to memorialize, to call people to responsibility represent some kind of global and systematic bias against a group, and then the people responsible for this global conspiracy are often identified specifically: George Soros or the Catholic Church, or heaven knows what. The list goes on. But what's interesting about these shifts, these ways in which denial become more refined, is that every time a shift is made, it's necessary for the people engaged in the denial to gather more information about the facts so that they know what facts have to be shifted in context, or what facts have to be diluted, or what facts have to be distorted. What this means is that every effort at denial requires also some level of recognition or some shift in the argument. That's how we go to the maybe that that I've mentioned in the title, because if the official position in Serbia, in Bosnia, it's a bit more complex, but if the official position in Serbia at the beginning was these events are inflated or these events didn't happen, that's not the official position now. I mean, the crude positions that I mentioned at the beginning, they still exist. You can find them. These different strategies of denial coexist with one another simultaneously, but the official position is that something did happen. It was a serious crime, but it was not genocide. And then to move into sort of sophistry about what does or does not constitute genocide. That is to say that there's a shift, but it's a shift that still, like all denial does, has the purpose of discrediting the experience and the emotion and the orientation of the other party. So this is what I want to do, just to give you a kind of insight into the complexity of processes of denial. I would only add one more point, and that is that all of this seemed both a burning issue and vital to refute in the period immediately after the crimes happened. We are now moving on to the 25th anniversary of the crimes that we're talking about. So there is distance, and many of these strategies have become a part of cultural activity, have become a part of journalism, have become a part of education. They have been normalized. So the passage of time tends to lend credibility to denial and to claims of equivalence, and this is something that we need to watch. So I will finish with that. Thank you very much once again for your time and for your attention.
Thank you very much. This is very powerful again, and I'm sure we will pick this up in the Q&A. I've actually done my little plug for your book, so I hope that people will get to it ASAP. Yasmine Nahlawi, please, if you could take us in a different direction, but along parallel lines, that would be excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hello. I think it's the same direction. And I hope I'll take the 5 minutes left from the time of Eric, maybe. I will share screen now. So is it okay? Do you see my screen now? Okay, great. Hello, everyone. My name is Yasmine Nahlawi. I'm the manager of Rethink Rebel Society, Manchester-based charity working with the Syrian refugees in the UK. Thank you for having me to talk about the context of Syria, which is very similar to what we have heard until now. Today, I'm going to talk about the Syrian conflict story. Is it simple or complicated? Sorry, just warning that this presentation has some graphic content. This is Syria for those who don't know Syria, between Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, and Mediterranean Sea. And the population in 2010 was 23 million, consisted of about 20 ethnic and religious groups. So if you ask the politicians or academic people, about the story of the Syrian conflict, they will give you this graph maybe, or this figure. And maybe they will put it under the title, a civil war that became proxy war between big powers. Actually, if we look at this figure, we'll see that there are like big powers fighting and other small groups. To be honest, this figure is, let's say, accurate and factual and real. We're not denying that. They are like proxy war in Syria between big powers, and sometimes they are fighting each other directly. But we have another version of the story, the simple story, which should form a beginning of the story, not about the ends. So if I start in 1970, when Hafez Assad, the father of the current president, Bashar Assad, became a president, and he remained as a president for 30 years. During those 30 years, he killed or imprisoned all of his opponents, and the famous Hama massacre in 1982, where about 40,000 people were killed in 1 month, and the city of Hama was destroyed, and alongside other cities as well at that time. After 30 years, his son Bashar became a president after him, And at that time, Syrian people were a bit optimistic that something will change, because Bashar Assad was a young man, he was a doctor, so people tried to feel optimistic that something will change. But unfortunately, for 10 years, nothing changed. And I will tell you a little bit about the Assad Syria through my personal experience in Syria. During the Bashar duration in presidency after 2000, when Hafiz died and his son Bashar became a president, my father-in-law Abdul Akram was an imam in a mosque, and the government ordered all imams to praise the late president and his son in the Friday speech. My father-in-law refused to do that, and he just gave an ordinary religious speech without any political aspect. Due to that, the government arrested my father-in-law for 3 months in very bad conditions. In 2003, a group of young people, including myself, tried to participate positively in our society, and we had some campaigns, social campaigns. We had anti-smoking campaign, anti-corruption campaign, and cleaning campaign. Due to those civil actions, 24 of our group were arrested by the security forces, including myself and my father-in-law. After 3 months of interrogations, we were sent to a secret field military court. That military court sentenced 9 of us for 3 years imprisonment, and sentenced me and another friend for 4 years imprisonment, including 7 months in solitary confinement. In 2005, I was still in prison. My father tried to raise his voice to release us and other political prisoners, and due to that, the government arrested him for 1 month. But at that time, in 2005, there was a pressure on the Syrian government because of what happened in Lebanon after al-Hariri assassination, so they released him. So from this little stories about the life under Assad control before 2011, before the uprising in 2011, we can understand why Syrian people followed suit what happened in other Arab countries during the Arab Spring, what was called as Arab Spring in 2011. So they started their own uprising. But what happened that it started actually by the government itself, when they arrested a group of children for writing some graffiti on the walls of their schools in Daraa. When their families tried to request the release of those children after being arrested and tortured in the detention centers, their request was refused. And they had the first protest in Daraa at that time. And it was the first protest in Syria, maybe for more than 40 or 50 years. The government immediately sent their troops, and they killed 4 people in that protest. And that sparked more protests in different cities in Syria to support the families of Daraa. Again, after the protest, they arrested tens of thousands of protesters. And this is in this photo. You see my father here. He participated only once in a protest in my hometown Daraya in March 2011, and just because of this participation, maybe for 20 minutes walking silently like that, he was arrested 3 times, 1 month, and then released again another 5 months, again another 5 months. And he was tortured. He was 65 at that time. He was tortured in the prison. And when he was released, he fled to Jordan. The 3rd time he fled to Jordan. My brother was filming one of the protests, And because of that, the security forces arrested him for 6 months, and also he fled to Jordan after his release. My father-in-law, he was against the uprising because he said that Assad regime is supported by the international community, and Assad would not leave Syria until he destroyed the whole of Syria. So he was against the uprising, but just because of his background as an opponent for the regime, they arrested him in July 2011, and he disappeared, and we don't know anything about him since that time. When we say that people are being being captured by Assad regime and the detention center of Assad regime, meaning that you are under daily torture, and all of these were documented hugely by human rights organizations. And we, of course, from my family member and friends, plenty of friends who were arrested and tortured, I heard all of these issues. Some of my friends were lucky enough to be released alive, but unfortunately others was not like that. This is some of Caesar's photos. Caesar is an alias. Sorry, I want to take that out. The Caesar photo, Caesar is an alias for an officer who from Assad army, who smuggled about 50,000 photos of detainees killed under torture in Assad's prisons. This is, and when those photos were released, we found the photos of our beloved people, friends and relatives. This is my friend, for example, Muhammad, whose photo was one of the Caesar's photos. All of this brutality against civilians didn't prevent cities from keep protesting against Assad regime. So Assad sent his troops to crush the protesting cities. And that forced some officers and soldiers to defect from the Syrian army. And they established at that time what was called a Free Syrian Army. Free Syrian Army was, managed to capture many areas from the Assad control. And that happened by, mainly started by themselves, but after that there was like little military support from the West, from Gulf countries and Turkey. But this is, when we say little support, that means light weapons. They don't have the tanks, or they don't have like anti-aircrafts or anything like that, which is very important against the like jet fighters of the regime at that time. Every area became outside the control of Assad. Assad used all sorts of weapons to destroy Syrian towns and cities that, as I said, became outside of his control. Since that time, we started hearing these numbers. Every day, 100 to 200 casualties, people killed by bombing. Continuous bombarding by all type of weapons, but the most brutal one was the barrel bombs, which is very cheap, invented by them. It's just like a barrel full of TNT and dropped by a helicopter on any areas. Most of those areas were civilians. So when after one barrel bomb, you find 4, sometimes more, building completely destroyed. If it's fall in the street, you'll find a street full of blood and bodies. And people don't have even the means to take the bodies from under the rubbles of the destroyed buildings. And the peak arrived in August 2013, when Assad regimes used chemical weapons against the people in Ghouta, in Damascus outskirts, where 1,400 people were killed in one night in August 2013. The response of the international community is, in one word, is nothing. At the beginning, they said that the chemical weapons is a red line. So that means that you can do whatever you want, but please don't use chemical weapons. But even when Assad regime used chemical weapons in August 2013, nothing happened. They reached this agreement to take out all of the chemical stock from Assad, and nothing about any talk about accountability about those crimes. Of course, that paved the way for some extremist groups, mainly ISIS at that time, recruited foreign fighters from all over the world. Suddenly, in 2013, we found like ISIS expanded suddenly in 2-3 days to take a huge part of Syria and huge part of Iraq at that in 2015, between 2013 and after that. Since that time, that changed the total picture completely. And since that time, the story became war and terror. In 2015, the coalition against ISIS was established by about 67 countries, of course, by the head of America at that time. And they managed to destroy ISIS after 2 years. On the other hand, Russia, Iran, Iraqi militias, Hezbollah in Lebanon was behind the Assad regime from the beginning, financially, military support, or even politically. For Russia, it used the veto many times in the UN Council. But in 2015, September, they found that Assad was about to fall down, and that forced Russia to intervene military by their jet fighters and their army. And the story again changed because of their advanced jet fighters. They were more brutal. They bombarded the cities day and night until people surrender. They managed to capture most of the areas from the hands of the opposition. The claim is they are targeting terrorist groups, but actually they targeted everything maybe except terrorist groups. They target buildings, schools, hospitals, everything. And every time the evacuation of Syrian people was the solution. Every time after bombarding the cities and towns for days and nights, the UN comes with this magic solution. The Assad and Russia will stop if you evacuate the place, if you go outside your towns. So this is the story with many cities and towns. People left their hometowns, moving most likely to the north, to Idlib. So Idlib was about 1 million in 2011. Now it is 4 million maybe. And also millions of Syrians fled the country to be refugees in neighboring countries or in Europe or elsewhere. This is my hometown, Daria. After the evacuation, it became ghost city at that time. It's a long video, just to give you a quick show about the amount of destruction and how it was empty, completely empty for years. Now they started allowing some people to go there. This is Syria map today. The red is it's controlled officially by Assad regime, but unofficially it's the area controlled by Russia and to some extent Iran and Hezbollah. The yellow one is the area controlled by the Kurdish people, but unofficially by America. And the area in purple and light green in the top, it's by Turkey. And the dark green in the top, the area just, this is the only area under the opposition control at this time. Final piece here is about the media bias, about how this story was framed in the media. I'll give you two directions of that. The first one is the incomplete story, and I will give you an example of the incomplete story. For example, a helicopter from the Assad army dropped 2 barrel bombs on a civilian area, and this was the daily life of Syrians for more than 5 years. these helicopters in the sky, dropping those barrel bombs on the cities and killing people. So that helicopter dropped the barrel bombs on a building accommodating 12 families. That building was completely destroyed. 10 people were killed, including 5 children. 4 people lost their legs and arms, and 2 people became paralyzed, and 2 people lost their eyes. Okay? The helicopter entered by mistake. This is a real example. Entered by mistake Turkey's border. So it was shot by Turkey's army. This is only two cases here for Turkey to shut down jet fighters because they entered their borders. The helicopter pilot landed in Syria and was captured by the rebels, and they immediately cut his head. Okay, so the following day in the international media, you will not see these photos, you will not see these numbers, but the following day in the international media, you will see this. Horrific footage shows Syrian helicopter pilot who was shot down by Turkish forces and then beheaded by rebels. I'm not justifying any of these actions of the rebels, but just I'm talking about how the incomplete story framed the story of the Syrian conflict. Finally, with the misleading titles. This is, for example, two BBC titles. The first one is Syria conflict airstrike destroys MSF-supported hospital. So the title is airstrike destroys MSF-supported hospital. Who did that? You should read the whole article to know, or even to take a hint about who did that. Although it's airstrike, usually who controlled the sky is in Syria. It's the Syria Assad regime and Russia. But the ordinary people, when they read the title, they most likely they only read the titles. The other title is Aleppo battle, rebels burn Syria evacuation buses. Here, rebels were mentioned in the title. When the opposition do something, they mention who did that. And we made a research about the BBC titles, and we found that when Assad regime and Russian backers were identified as perpetrators, only 4 out of 38 titles, they were mentioned in the titles as the perpetrators. But in contrast, when it's ISIS or it is opposition fighters, they don't mention, sorry, they were said in the example earlier on. So my final thought, what is the effect on Syria and Syrians? First of all, it's writing the history, and I think Eric and Edita talked about that. Writing the history of what happened in Syria, that instead of talking about the Syrian people, the uprising of Syrian people to get their freedoms from a dictatorial regime, starting with this, it's just maybe we'll talk now about war and terror, that Assad regime and Russia were fighting terrorist groups. It affects badly the image of all Syrians. I felt that personally in 2011 and 2012, when I say I'm from Syria, people will say, "Oh, from Syria, you are brave, you are like standing against a very brutal regime." But after 2013, when you say I'm from Syria, so oh, Syria, very bad situation, ISIS, there are terrorist groups there. So, and even when they know that you are opposing the Assad, they will link you with those terrorist groups. So that led to, and this is most important for us as a Rethinkable Society, as an organization working for refugees, losing sympathy with Syrians and Syrian refugees. Because people, when you say that, oh, it's civil war, people are killing each other, people will lose sympathy with the victims of that war. So finally, I hope that we don't like support or like help the criminals to justify that they are there, they're still controlling Syria because they have the support of the Syrians by saying the half of the story. but we need the complete story, why they are still in power until now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's again a very powerful testimonial. I am conscious of time, so I'm Yasmine. A lot of pressure on you to keep to your time if you can. But thank you so much. This is again, you can see the parallels arising very clearly about how the treatment and the memory and the narrative can escape the victims of acts of extraordinary brutality and violence and genocide. Right, so without further ado, Yasmine, please.
Thank you, Bertrand. And I have to say, I just feel that my heart is so heavy after listening to all of the former speakers. And I hope that I can do this topic justice as well, continuing on from Haytham's talk on Syria. And I want to look more at the international dimension of what's happened in Syria. So Haytham did a good job of highlighting how the media narrative was portrayed on the conflict. And I want to show how the competing narratives on Syria affected international decision-making. And before I get started on talking about Syria, I want to draw an analogy that hopefully will hit close to home for most people, as it's very relevant, recent, timely, which is the Trump campaign. So with the Trump campaign and the wider Trump administration, they have built this narrative on a series of false premises. And the narrative is so solid and it's so reinforcing that there is nothing that you could do or say to a Trump supporter that would cause them to rethink their opinion. So whatever a news piece, statistics, videos, pictures, data, no matter what you throw at this narrative, it is self-reinforcing that it will deflect. So for example, if you say statistics, they will give you an alternative set of statistics. If you cite a news piece, this is simply the fake liberal news media. If you show a picture or a video, this picture or video is taken out of context. So there is no way that you can win with this administration or with this wider narrative. And we see the same exact thing happening in Syria. In Syria, the Assad regime has similarly painted or built an entire very solid narrative. So to someone who's going to buy into this narrative, it is reinforcing, and there is no way that you can penetrate it through the traditional means at your disposal, i.e. facts, media reports, eyewitness testimony. They have constructed the narrative in a way that anything that you put forward will be deflected. So for example, the conflict in Syria didn't start as a result of peaceful protests of the people, but rather as they imply or as they argue, that the conflict was started as a result of terrorist organizations that were actually funded by the West. When you put footage of aerial bombardments, such as the ones that we saw in Haytham's presentation, or the chemical attacks that we also saw, these are either not committed by Assad, they're committed by terrorist groups, or they are staged in Hollywood. And they've gone as far as to show where actors have been recycled or supposedly recycled in different cities. So they will show, for example, a little girl that looks similar to a little girl in a different city and say that, you know, they've actually recycled these actors. And the White Helmets, who are a rescue organization, who have been described as having the most dangerous job in the world, because their job is literally to go into the sites that have been bombarded by Assad warplanes and to dig people out of the rubble. And in the process, they are at risk of being hit by a second bombardment because the Assad regime frequently uses double tap attacks. So it will attack a place, come back in 20 minutes and strike the same place again because it knows that people will have gathered to uncover the bodies. So this rescue organization, the White Helmets, have been deemed a terrorist organization, also one funded by the West. So there is nothing that you can use that will challenge or effectively challenge the narrative to the people who have bought into it. And this is the narrative that the regime has presented since day one, and it has been fortified and it has been marketed by Russia. And here I want to talk about the significance of Russia as not only a world power, but also as a permanent member of the Security Council. So, so as not to complicate things or not to get too technical, basically what it means is that Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council and it has the right to the veto. The right to the veto means that it can reject any draft resolution in the Council. So there's 5 permanent members, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China. Each of these countries have the power to reject any draft resolution that they want for any reason that they want. So even if 14 of the 15 Security Council states vote in favor of a resolution, all it takes is one veto to thwart it. And since the beginning of the Syrian conflict, which has been almost 10 years ago now, Russia has exercised its veto on 16 different occasions, and sometimes along with China as well. And these 16 draft resolutions that they vetoed sought to authorize a range of measures, including on chemical weapons, on humanitarian access, on ceasefires, on referring the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. And all of these measures have been in the context of non-military proposals. So I want to talk about, I want to start by talking about the abusiveness of the vetoes and how we can characterize these vetoes as abusive, and then talk a little bit about the repercussions that they've imparted on the trajectory of the conflict. So first of all, as I mentioned, their arguments, Russia and China have consistently argued that these draft resolutions sought to authorize military force or regime change in Syria. But when you look at the actual text of the resolution, it simply doesn't hold. As I mentioned, these authorized or sought to authorize a range of non-military measures, including the referral to the ICC and so on and so forth. In addition to that, when you look at Russia's very deeply vested national interests in Syria, we see another pattern of characterizing these vetoes as abusive. So Syria is the host to the only Russian military base outside the former Soviet Union. So Syria is a very strategic partner, and it's not one that Russia is going to give up on very easily. And so Russia hasn't stopped at providing military assistance or economic assistance to Syria. As Haytham mentioned, Russia is in Syria. It is directly in Syria with its military, with its air force. It is conducting airstrikes on behalf of Assad. It is conducting military operations on behalf of Assad. So this is another